welcome to Constituting America's Constitutional Chats. And we would love for you to spend just a few minutes kind of giving us an overview on
Sure.
what the Constitution says about war and some of the different powers that are embodied in the three branches, and maybe just a little bit on the founders' views.
Sure. And happy to do that, Kathy. And thank you all very much for having me. This is an organization that I have, as Kathy said, supported since day one. I believe in the organization's mission wholeheartedly because these are issues. It's funny, real quick. When I was in school and growing up and, learning about the Constitution, these are issues that I was passionate about. But it really wasn't until I was in my first job out of college working for a blind lawyer and a lawyer working on constitutional issues that I really understood how these issues really play out on a daily basis. And obviously, constitutional issues are constantly playing out in the public sphere, but sort of bringing them home to me and learning more about it. That's how I became passionate about these issues, and most especially about the issues regarding the separation of powers and the diffusion of sovereign power, because these are issues that the founders were enormously concerned with. And our Constitution itself is replete with examples of how the founders were skeptical of concentrated federal power, whether it's concentrated power on the legislative side of things or concentrated power on the executive branch side of things. And so, reading about these issues, researching these issues, talking about these issues, as you can tell, is a great passion of mine. And no more is this better demonstrated than the debates we're having right now over what the U.S. ought to be doing vis-a-vis what's happening in Russia and Ukraine. And any discussion of what the U.S. is doing militarily and from a foreign policy perspective has to be rooted in what the Constitution has to say about these things, right? In the end, all of government powers stem from the powers that the Constitution grants. And actually, I'll digress and say, in all of these discussions, the one takeaway I always want anybody to have, whether it's students or adults or what have you, is we have to remember that the Constitution doesn't give anybody rights. Our rights exist. The Constitution assigns powers and narrowly prescribes those powers. People have rights, and everything that we don't surrender to the government in the form of power is a right that we retain. Very, very important here when we're talking about this. So, hearkening back to the Constitutional Convention and the debates over the founding of the United States, central in all of this was how much, obviously, governmental power, political power, the federal government might have. But bound up in this, of course, was the military power. We'd gone through a Revolutionary War in which we'd seen the excesses of the British government, the British military power as against our citizens here in the United States. And one of the things that the founders wanted to do was to make sure that any military power, the power to wage war, was constrained. When we became a government, there were folks, Alexander Hamilton for one, who wanted us to be a more adventurous, more imperialistic power in terms of exercising our military might. But people like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, Washington, of course, who'd been a general, been in war, they were deeply dubious of this. They did not want to see America have a standing army, for instance. They wanted a military in the form of a navy that would serve to protect the nation's shores. That's sort of the extent of it all. And so bound up in all of this is how the Constitution views these so-called war powers, granting in Article 1 the power to Congress to declare war. And then leaving it, to sort of dividing it up and leaving it to the president to be commander in chief of the military. And what this meant was that a unified executive could not turn around and sort of willy-nilly decide that we were going to get into war, that there would have to be some kind of voice of the people involved in this. Because remember, we are not a pure democracy. We are a democratic republic, or a republican democracy, where these powers and rights get balanced out. And so you had a situation in which, yes, Congress would be responsible for getting in and actually declaring the war itself, and then leave it to the executive branch to go ahead and prosecute that war. And then in and of itself, just to sort of as a side note here to say that originally, as I said, we did not have a standing army. After the Revolutionary War, the Continental Army was largely disbanded, and those powers devolved to state militias. Again, sort of diffusing that power down, they wanted to make sure that the state governments had a voice in all of this, that they had a responsibility here, and more to the point that there wasn't this concentrated military power in the federal government. So, fast forward. This is viewed as a very straightforward power, right? Only Congress can declare the war. But as the world becomes larger, as it becomes more interconnected, and as things get much more complicated on the world stage, so too do these powers sort of get muddied. And so, really, the last time we declared war. So it's recognized that should America be attacked, the executive branch should have some kind of flexibility to respond. So, for instance, December 7th, 1941, America is attacked at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, but we don't automatically go into war as a result of that. Congress has to literally declare that war. So that's sort of the last war that was declared. After World War II, there are a series of military actions that are protracted, but don't constitute wars because Congress didn't declare war. So Korea, for instance, and our defense of the South Koreans vis-a-vis the North Koreans and China, et cetera, that was a police action. Then in the 1960s, America gets involved in the Vietnam conflict. Again, we call it the Vietnam War, but Congress never declared it as a war. And as a result of these kinds of activities in which there were huge costs to American lives, Congress passes in the early 1970s a war powers resolution. And what that says is that in the event of some kind of crisis, military crisis, America is attacked or one of our allies is attacked or there's some direct threat to American national security, the president can dispatch troops, provided that he notify he or she, because we will get a female president at some point, but the president has to notify Congress between 48 hours. And then essentially the president has 90 days to conduct this operation without some sort of further congressional approval, and has to continue to report on this to Congress. So 60 days for the operation, and then a 30-day period to extricate American troops from that operation should it come to pass. But President Nixon threatened to veto it. It never actually was signed by the president. But right now, what there exists is this, I'm going to call a quasi-constitutional environment in which a president sort of recognizes the war powers resolution and reports to Congress commensurate with the war powers resolution without Congress sort of voting. And keep in mind that Congress has the power of the purse strings and the power of to direct the president, the executive branch, to get out of a military operation if they don't want them to be there. Now, what does this all have to do with the present conflict? Well, it's really interesting in that one of the areas of conflict that we see under this war powers resolution and the tension between the executive branch and Congress, it came to a head in a situation in 1999. Now, as we're talking about the present conflict in Russia and Ukraine, and I'm happy to answer questions about that as we get to the question and answer session. One of the things that Russia has raised is the expansion of NATO. And at first blush, I think that this is generally true, NATO is seen as a benign defensive organization, really not posing any threat to Russia. And it doesn't pose any threat to Russia, at least I don't think so. But in 1999, we get this strange situation. For those of you who are the uninitiated, after the fall of communism and the collapse of something called the Warsaw Pact, which was the collection of Central and Eastern European nations, a civil war erupted in a country that was then called Yugoslavia. It was comprised of a bunch of different republics within it. And the United States and NATO had been involved for many years in peacekeeping operations to prevent a variety of genocides from taking place. Well, in 1999, a republic called Serbia, which was considering itself the successor to Yugoslavia, they started cleansing, killing Albanians, Kosovar Albanians. And for whatever reason, even though NATO and the international community had been involved up to this point, the United States Congress and the United Nations were opposed to NATO getting more involved, and in fact engaging in what became a 3-month air bombing campaign in Albania. And so you had a situation in which a president was acting militarily, informing Congress under the auspices of the War Powers Resolution, but Congress making it explicitly clear to the White House that they were fundamentally against all of this. And it created this morass that was never, no court has ever considered the constitutionality. And because the War Powers Resolution is not considered a statute per se, a president could not be impeached for violating it. But anyway, you have these tensions that are out there. And so they're spilling over to today with the fundamental question as to what can and should the United States do with regards to this particular situation between Russia and Ukraine. And the answer, at the very least, beyond anything else, is if the United States were going to get further involved, theoretically, if we're going to declare war, not that we necessarily would, but if we were, Congress would have to do that. But if NATO were attacked somehow in all of this, then it would be the president, under the auspices of the War Powers Resolution, the president would have 48 hours to notify Congress if U.S. troops were getting involved, and then essentially 90 days to conduct whatever operations were there beyond getting some kind of congressional authorization. Now, the point is, far short of that direct military engagement, right, the Constitution is much, much less clear. Because the president is commander-in-chief of the United States military forces, the president has great leeway up to the point of direct military engagement to do things. So what that means is there is great leeway in terms of training Ukrainian troops in Ukraine, for instance, or supplying the Ukrainian people with military weapons, United States military weapons, even finding a way to get Polish MiGs to Ukraine, should that come to pass. At the same time, while the executive branch can do that, Congress maintains its power of the purse. So Congress could theoretically turn around and say to President Biden, no, you can't do this. We're not going to give you the funds to do this. You are especially prohibited from doing this. And that would be constitutional. So that's where we are. Again, the idea is, and actually, let me add one thing. There is a great blessing in the fact that we have this division, that a president cannot take it upon himself and herself to commit our troops in, theoretically in perpetuity to something like this without Congress having a say in it. The problem does arise in which, these efforts can be politicized in a way that sometimes they just shouldn't be. But that's the trade-off that we face. I think we are better off for it, for having that trade-off. But with that in mind, I've gone for about 15 minutes here. Let me open up the floor, Kathy, if that's okay, to questions.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. That was really fascinating and very enlightening. And when we first started doing research for this show, and we noted that Congress hasn't declared war since 1941. And why do you think that is? Did the president not ask Congress to declare war since 1941, or how has that evolved?
Well, I think part of it is, with the notable exception of September 11th, the United States hasn't been attacked. That we have exercised our military authority under the guise of, and I don't want to use the phrase world's policeman, but in the guise of protecting freedom or protecting democracy, as what we call sort of our Great Commission, as as a free and independent nation, that we considered our obligation to help those folks who are less fortunate. So, again, with September 11th being different, right? With September 11th, we weren't attacked by a nation state. We were attacked by what we call a non-state actor, who happened to be hiding in the auspices of a rogue state. So we couldn't really declare war against Afghanistan because Afghanistan hadn't attacked us. So we created this concept of, and again, I'm not, this sounds like I'm dismissing it. I don't mean to be. We coined the term the war on terror as a way of sort of getting at this. But if you think about it, right? I mean, we weren't attacked in Korea. Our allies were. Vietnam, same thing. Setting aside how you might think about what they call the Gulf of Tonkin incident, and it's always been sort of the U.S. sort of taking steps to protect others.
It's a very good point.
Yeah.
And would you say with the War Powers Act of 1973, would you say that was Congress's attempt to regain power to declare
Absolutely.
war over the president? So do you think there was a concern at that time that the president was beginning to take too much leeway?
Well, yeah, I mean, again, setting aside nearly 2 decades of American involvement in both Iraq and Afghanistan, up to that point, right, we'd spent years in Korea only to come to a stalemate. And then in Vietnam, we did not achieve victory. The North Vietnamese were victorious in that at a huge cost of American lives, and the appearance that not a lot had been gained in terms of U.S. interests. So, building on the mindset at the time, not to get too deep into the politics, but all kinds of powers of the executive branch were reined in. In fact, let me again digress for a second, Kathy, because if you think for a second more generally about what was happening in the 1960s and a lot of the protests of the government in the 1960s, there were a lot of protests against the excesses and abuses of power by a series of administrations, not just the Nixon administration, but the Johnson administration as well. And so Congress stepped in and instituted a series of reforms to the military and to the intelligence community and elsewhere, serving to rein in the abuses of those powers. I submit that one of the great failures of the 1960s was a lack of recognition on the part of those calling for reform that part and parcel of the problem was the size and scope of the federal government. Federal government, I want to be really simple. I'm sorry if I'm sort of sounding like a college lecturer here. To put it very simply, when a government gets so big and powerful, those powers are apt to be abused. And the only answer when government is abusing the powers that it has is to curtail those powers, to shrink the size and scope of that government. As Margaret Thatcher says, a government that is big enough to give you everything is powerful enough to take it all away. And anyway, we can this is true whether it's sort of in military power or regulatory power or what have you. But we saw this as a theme to get at the heart of your question. We saw this as a theme of curtailing executive branch power vis-a-vis military and intelligence throughout the 1960s, throughout the 1970s, I mean.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
And I know our students have got some great questions ready. So I'm going to turn this over to Tova.
Yep.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this is fascinating. I love foreign affairs. So this is great to learn about. Looking back at kind of the Ukraine-Russia crisis, it's interesting to me that Russia has a constitution and they like to, build themselves as a republic. However, obviously, it seems that their constitution hasn't held up as well as ours has with regards to executive power and the way civil liberties are being very overrun. So could you do kind of a comparison between the two systems and why the US's has held up so well and maybe the Russian hasn't?
The grand irony, right? For the 70 years of the existence of the Soviet Union is that the Soviet Union had a constitution and guaranteed certain rights. The problem was, of course, now I would point out one very stark contrast with the Soviet constitution was that the Soviet Union didn't protect private property rights. And a nation that doesn't protect private property rights can run roughshod over all of your other rights. Because again, getting back to what Margaret Thatcher said, a government that is big enough to give you everything is powerful enough to take it all away. So if your government has the ability to kick you out of your housing or close down your business or what have you, It means that you are all of your other rights are going to be held cheaply. Now that's built on the strongman centralized government tradition. It reaches back for 600 years in Russian history. So when the Soviet Union fell and the new Russian governments, because there were a series of successive Russian governments, were created, there was no similar because over the course of the 600 years of, maybe even more, 700 years of pre-Soviet Russian history, there was not the same adherence to Western classical liberal democratic values that we have. So while they have a constitution, again, the various rights are held subservient to the power of the executive branch. The executive branch, the Putin centralized presidential government has enormous power. And then when you combine it with the omnipresent police state, which again goes back not 600 years, but 300 years, 200 years. It's essentially a state that is built on paranoia and coercion, as opposed to true classical liberal freedom, right? Freedom of movement, freedom of expression, etc. So the same rights are not quite guaranteed in the same ways, with this threat of being subverted or otherwise intimidated by the central government.
Got it. Thank you. And then, of course, the nature of war has changed a lot since the founders were in power.
Oh, yeah.
Before it was all physical. Now, especially you see with the Russia-Ukraine crisis, a lot of the war thus far has been like economic, right? Us imposing sanctions and maybe in the future more cyber warfare, like cyber attacks. So how does this changing nature of war affect the constitutional framework and our system of government and how it attacks war?
Well, that's a really good question, and it's a good question insofar as it's funny. I had a conversation a few months back before this conflict was being born, talking about cyber attacks from Russia and cyber criminalization and how much of this is being done by, well, again, getting back to this concept of what they call non-state actors. A non-state actor is someone who poses a threat to your nation, but who isn't a part of the country. Well, a lot of the Russian cyber criminals, they're quote unquote non-state actors, but they're working on behalf of the Russian government. Because everybody, right, that's the other part of this, is every business, especially every big business in Russia, is somehow connected to the Russian government. There's a real interplay there. So no one's acting really independently, unlike in the United States, where we are constantly having corporations thumbing their nose at government, depending on who is in power. Anyway, had a conversation with a former general talking about cybersecurity, and he suggested it's a really interesting idea, because remember, one of the powers that Congress has is the power to grant what are called letters of marque and reprisal, which is this idea of essentially, right, this gets back to on the high seas, we had a fledgling Navy, but what we would do is we would hand a letter to a ship captain, and that ship captain could go and attack the merchants and war vessels of another nation and take the spoils of war and be rewarded for it. And it was sort of a way for us to wage war without waging war. So this general said, maybe we ought to do the same thing with regards to cyber criminals, and sort of create a system where we grant letters of marque. And so someone can go off, and if they can get the bounties from these cyber criminals, they get to keep a percentage. Anyway, it's an interesting idea, applying these old ways of looking at things at what's happening on the ground. The reality is, and Tove, you're absolutely correct, that we are engaging in kinds of warfare that would not have been viewed as warfare by our founders. And it's a way of achieving results so that we're not focused on the military. I'm not so sure whether or not we would necessarily look at waging sort of economic warfare, and at times it's warfare, at times it's just competition. I'm not sure I would want to look at it in the same way, from a constitutional perspective, in the same way as what comes under the war powers issues. But keep in mind, as a bedrock principle of sort of looking at American governance, is that whatever restrictions you put on government, you will always have people who are trying to find a workaround. I know that sounds sort of cynical and a little tongue in cheek, but there are many sort of tools in the toolkit for a government to use to achieve these ends. And this gets into the concept of soft power versus hard power. And I think ultimately the war powers issues exist because American men and women, I'm not going to call them boys and girls, that I think that cheapens it, but American men and women can put themselves directly in harm's way and be killed. And so we have to find a way to think deeply about this, right? I say this in the essay, and if you spend any time hearing me talk about these things, you all know that I like to quote from a 1992 Supreme Court decision called New York versus United States. And one of my favorite quotes, and if you had 31 minutes and 48 seconds before I said it, you win the prize. Justice O'Connor said, "The Constitution protects us from our own best intentions. It divides power among sovereigns and among branches of government precisely so that we might resist the temptation to concentrate power in one branch as the expedient solution to the crisis of the day." The Constitution is all about looking before you leap. It's all about being deliberative. So whether it is what we're going to do in Russia and Ukraine, or whether it's what we're going to do in the face of a pandemic, or what we're going to do in the face of an energy crisis, it wants us to think deeply about these things before we go down these roads.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you. And then we've talked a lot about kind of the rules that govern warfare within our country.
Yeah.
But I was curious about kind of the international rules that govern warfare. So obviously we have things like the Geneva Convention or United Nations resolutions that govern war. But I was curious, so if you could talk about that. But then also at the time of the founders, they didn't have the UN or anything like that. But were there any kind of international norms or frameworks that guided how they conducted war?
Well, I mean, there were sort of rules of gentlemanly conduct. I mean, there were sort of international admiralty rules for how you sort of conduct things on the high seas. A lot of this was informal, though generally understood by folks who were sort of operating on the high seas. In terms of conduct on the battlefield, yeah, I mean, there again, it wasn't sort of set down in conventions in the same way that the Geneva Convention is, or the way the various UN conventions govern things. But there were essentially rules of gentlemanly conduct, and if you broke those things and you behaved less than honorably, there would be or could be repercussions to it. So the Geneva Convention was founded after, essentially created after World War I. World War I was an incredibly devastating, bloody conflict in which there really were no rules on the battlefield. And so you had this kind of trench warfare in which all kinds of really nasty, horrible weapons were used, whether it was chemical weapons or whether it was certain kinds of explosives that targeted specific parts of a man's body. It was particularly horrible. And so there became an agreement about how we would conduct ourselves, the general rules that would be out there, how you would treat prisoners. You go through the conflict treatment of prisoners of war, depending on the nation, could just be horrendous. So there had to be some way of dealing with this. So we created this kind of a Geneva Convention to govern this. And then there are other sorts of rules that are out there, whether it's conventions that the UN has put together against the use of certain kind of chemical weapons or certain kind of biological weapons, or conventions against nuclear weapons. And the problem, of course, is that there are no repercussions per se if a state actor or an individual within a nation decides that they're going to use these kinds of weapons, right? You can try someone for what are called war crimes, but it can be very hard to prosecute those. You have to catch them, you have to get them to the court, you have to create the evidence, and then how do you sort of mete out the punishment? So it's a way of doing things, but there's no deterrent effect in the same way that our laws can present a deterrent effect to criminal activity here. And with that in mind, right, there are two things that we have to consider. Number one is that there are nations that are creating new kinds of weapons all the time that may not have these international conventions apply to them. So for instance, non-nuclear weapons that have the same kind of devastating impact as a nuclear weapon without the radiological impacts. We haven't begun to address those on the international scope right now. And then there was something else that I was going to add here. Russia And and then it's really interesting, right? Because I didn't talk about this much a moment ago. I want to just touch on this for a second. So we talked a little bit about the Russian view of law and rights over the course of the last 600 years. So Russia has been as I said, a fairly insular society. Whether it's anyway, there are a lot of reasons for this. But one of the stark differences in terms of military doctrine is we view our military weapons as defensive in nature only. The Russian military doctrine doesn't view them in the same way, that they think that there can be tactical nuclear weapons that can be deployed on a battlefield, and not create the same kinds of horrific, well, they will create horrific, devastating results, but it doesn't engender the same kind of institutional horror that nuclear weapons do here. So, yeah, and then, again, if we hit Armageddon, God forbid, then international convention goes out the window.
Wow, thank you. Definitely lots to think about.
Yes.
And then I guess my final question, this is just something I've observed and I was curious to kind of get your thoughts on it. With the Ukraine-Russia crisis, it seems to me that a lot of the Ukrainian people and kind of their leader, Zelensky, have kind of framed their fight in a lot of the same way, like kind of appealing to American ideals and kind of founding ideals, like individual, like they're framing themselves as fighting for individual freedom, the right to self-rule and everything. And I found it was really interesting to draw those parallels. So I'm curious if you get the same impression as an observer, and why you think that those ideals resonate so much with the Ukrainian people.
Well, keep in mind, right? So there, we're not going to get into a variety of the theories that are out there about the underpinnings of this conflict and the geopolitical struggles that are there. But the Ukrainian issue and the Ukrainian issues of governance for the last decade and a half, really, going back to the early 2000s, have all been about the push and pull between Western Europe and Western classical liberalism and Russia and Moscow. And so you have this tension between the two. They're two, again, very starkly different worldviews. One, again, is focused on this issue of classical liberalism, the concept of democracy, the ideas that freedom is the most important value that we have and that we put up. And the other is, well, we have this national identity that corresponds to Russia. In fact, what we now know as Muscovy Russia had its roots in Kievan Russia 600 years ago. And so there's this tie there. And so it came to a head in the early part of the 2010s, where you had Ukraine moving towards joining the European Union. And then there was an abrupt about face by the president of Ukraine at the time. And one can only imagine that he was being put under heavy pressure by the Vladimir Putin, by the Russian government, and abruptly his government changed course and moved away. And moved towards being closer with Moscow once again. And the people of Ukraine were very unhappy about this. Now, you could say it was a CIA-backed coup. You could call it a revolution. Either way, the government changed abruptly. And then there was, a series of governments in which ultimately Vladimir Zelensky was elected president of Ukraine. But the whole point is that there was this change in government because the people of Ukraine wanted to be more closely affiliated with the European Union and classical liberal Western democracies than they did with Russia. And so one can only imagine. Let me add something to this as we talk about this. And this does get into a little bit of my editorializing. I'm happy to talk more about it. But let's keep in mind that at the end of the day, it was Russia that decided to invade Ukraine, right? Ukraine was a sovereign nation. And that, assuming for a moment that Russia was worried about NATO, and we can talk about this if folks want to know why really there was never any danger of Ukraine joining NATO. We can get into that in a moment if you want. But regardless of Russia's concerns about breakaway republics or Russia's concerns about Nazis in the Ukrainian government, all of which we can discuss if you want, the reality is that there were plenty of options available to Russia well short of invading on three axes from the north, the south, and the east, invading another sovereign nation. And to contrast this with what happened in Yugoslavia with NATO throughout the 1990s, NATO's involvement and the United States involvement up until the 1999 bombing of Yugoslavia was done with the full support of the international community. And even when NATO started bombing Yugoslavia in 1999, NATO had gone the step, and the United States, the Clinton administration, because again, contrasting with Congress, the Clinton administration had gone and sought international approval for their actions. They at least tried to get international approval for it. And they frankly tried to get congressional approval for what they were doing. So they went through and did all of these things that Russia did not do. And so Russia does not want Ukraine for whatever reason. They certainly don't want them to join NATO, but they don't want them affiliated with Western Europe. They don't want them to be a part of the EU. They want them within the Russian sphere of influence. This is why they invaded Crimea. This is why they worked hard to get the Donbass regions to be declared independent, or to declare them independent republics, because they wanted this. And again, now we can be frank about it. Because of the way Russia attacked Ukraine, we know that Russia wanted regime change in Ukraine. They wanted to effect that regime change. And it was only because of the spirit of the people of Ukraine, frankly, given a lot of highly advanced weapons by nations, including the United States, that they were able to push them back. And now we have them pivoting back to the Eastern republics once again. But it was they wanted regime change because, for a whole host of reasons, they did not want Ukraine out of the Russian sphere of influence.
Great, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I will pass on to Jewel. Thank you for your insight.
Hey, happy to do it.
So another very intriguing, interesting show. It's so cool we go to foreign policy because it's where people who still have a constitutional outlook may then also disagree. One thing that you said that's so important, which is where Constitution of America will come from, is to understand that the Constitution was written in order to grant certain rights to the government, not grant certain rights to the people. Well, now what about the people's rights of other nations? And of course, that comes into play. We're talking about any type of foreign policy or military action. Now, you brought up Korea, you brought up Vietnam, you brought up some other conflicts. Now, I wonder, it seems to me like we will not declare war from Congress as we had in the past, because there's not as much of a political incentive for them to declare war. You're probably not going to get elected because you declared war. Today, if someone's living right here, the public opinion has been more so against war pretty much in America for most of our history, because we have two buffers of the oceans. And in general, you're not going to see the troops landing on our shores. It never has happened. So we don't quite see it on our front doorsteps the same way. Now, with modern technology, we all know that that's just that's a blessing. That's not necessarily a right. We're just never going to have war here. But we know the media exploited different things in the wars and changed public opinion, whether for good or for bad. People saw death. People saw murder. People saw horrible images they had not seen before. So what do you think as far as that framing of the situation where we've not declared war and what I posited as a possible reason?
Well, listen, I again, this gets into the whole idea of the tension between the will to act quickly and the political will to deliberate, right? And we have to have that. We have to be a deliberative nation. I'm going to add something to this, Jewel, which is this idea of foreign actors who are working very hard to turn us against one another and to foment confusion against one another, so that we don't have a national will to act and do things. And listen, I'll be very candid in all of this. So I'm someone, not only is my degree in international relations, my degree is in Russian studies. I was at the time a Soviet studies major at William and Mary. So these issues of what's happening in Russia and Ukraine are very near and dear to my heart. one of the problems that I was having, especially in the first week of the conflict, was getting access to good information, because, we'd see a story and then we'd come to find out that that story wasn't true. And I'll get a good example is the Snake Island story, which is the issue of the sailors, the Ukrainian sailors who were on the island. The Russian ship comes. Anyway, you know the story. Turns out they weren't killed. In the end, it's not that major an issue at the time. It was a big one. And the point is that there were folks who were, who I will say, being professionally skeptical of this conflict. I'm not going to say they were being pro-Russian, leave that as it may. The point is that they were able to point to this as a way of raising doubt about the narrative that was being pushed regarding the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Again, remembering that at the end of the day, it was Russia that decided to invade Ukraine, not the other way around. But to muddy the waters here. So to get to the crux of what you're asking, right? So some of it has to do with national will, and the reality, of course, being that because we are putting our young men and women into harm's way, we have to think deeply about this. It was, I think, there was also a different time when people were serving involuntarily, right? When there was a draft on. So that changed the way that people viewed things. I think people viewed things with a little bit less sophistication than we do today about it. But when you are sending men and women who have no choice in the matter to fight, that's one way of looking at it. But at the end of the day, right? We if we're going to commit our troops in this way, we have to think deeply. But I think to sort of come back to what I said initially, I think the crux of why we haven't declared war is because we haven't been attacked in the same way that we were attacked in World War II. Because keep in mind that up until 1941, we'd had 5+ years where there was war being waged in Europe and we weren't getting involved, and we were being asked to get involved time and again, and we didn't. It took us getting attacked by Japan that was the tipping point for all of us. That's it in the end. I think it is a great hallmark of America that we are allowed to have these debates over this, whether it is the debates leading up to the Civil War and frankly during the Civil War, whether it's the debates that we had in America about getting involved in World War I, the debates that we had getting involved in World War II. I think there are folks who wish we'd have more debates up until the point where we got involved in Vietnam. And then it's interesting you said this. Actually, I'm sorry, Joel, just to get back to one of the things you said, which is how it plays into the electoral politics aspect of it. I think it can cut both ways depending on where you are and who you are. If you are a congresswoman from the Bay Area, there is no downside to you voting against getting involved in, invading Afghanistan or invading Iraq in 2003. I think it's different if you're from the 1st Congressional District of Texas. So depending on what your constituents want and how they view you. So it can be. I think in the end, it also gets down to the more protracted these conflicts are, how politics plays into drawing out those conflicts. That can be a problem. It's one of those things where it is a tough balancing act, because you have to have the people's input into things, but we also get down to this issue. I don't know if you've ever heard the adage, a camel is a horse designed by a committee. And so, if the more you get, the more cooks you have involved in the kitchen of warfare, the more problematic it can be. And, we can point to whether or not it's the back and forth over the search. Listen, the back and forth over aiding Ukraine between, 2014 and 2021, 2022, all of those things get in there. And so, anyway, ultimately history is the greatest judge. Hindsight is 2020. There are always mistakes that are made.
And just a quick follow-up before the audience questions. So think about a way to ask this quickly. I said it last week, and I want to hear your take on it as well. I'll say it in a different way though. How important do you think decisive military action is, as far as even in a constitutional sense, that when we act, that we act decisively and with a clear goal, whether or not, and I guess what I would be referring to is that can you halfway help? Should you start a conflict,
Sure.
and then when political winds change your mode operandi when you've already begun it.
It's the concept, Jewel, of in for a penny, in for a pound. Here's the reality, right? You have to have clear goals. Obviously, because it's politics, goals can change. I've watched this. I will say, you can have clear goals going in, but as my wife says, and my wife was in the military for 25 years, no battle plan survives first contact with the enemy. And that's just something you have to remember. These things can change. On the other hand, if you go in and you don't know why you're going in, then that begs the question as to why you're going in the first place. What does victory look like? You should have some general idea as to what that is. But again, the annals of military history are replete with examples of political vagaries changing, and again, hindsight being 2020. A prime example is the 10 years that we were funding the Mujahideen in Afghanistan to get the Soviets out of Afghanistan. Once the Soviets left, we had no plan for what to happen after, and it gave rise to the Taliban. That's, it is what it is.
All right. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
We'll have some audience questions.
Well, thank you, Jewel and Tova, for your great questions as usual. And Sharon Tate says, thanks, Tova. That cleared up some questions that I had about the Ukraine. So thank you for Andrew, Ron Meyer writes in and wants to go back to the cyber warfare concept for a minute. He says in 1973, there was no cyber warfare. Today, we have a new military branch for cyber, and the WPR doesn't account for cyber attacks. What if we were cyber attacked? How can we determine if that is an attack on the United States of sufficient magnitude to require a declaration of war?
So I think in the end, right, this is where political will would expose itself. I think, right, it would start with operating under the auspices of the War Powers Resolution. If we are attacked in that way, the president would engage with our military cyber warfare capabilities, have 48 hours to notify Congress, and then I guess could do it for 90 days. If that wasn't sufficient for Congress, then I think ultimately it will be up for Congress to sort of step in there and say, okay, we need something more. And if the administration isn't going to do this, then they would work on the power of the purse strings in order to deal with it. Right. Again, you're getting back into exactly what happened back in 1999 with NATO and Yugoslavia. And, it was funny, Jewel was asking about the politics of it all. You look at the various responses by Congress to what the Clinton administration was doing in Yugoslavia, and they were all over the place. And there wasn't sort of not only was there not a clear sort of response, but there also wasn't a clear overarching piece of legislation that came out of it. Congress was not happy with what the Clinton administration was doing, but they didn't take steps to enact new laws that would work to further rein in the president's power. So I think at the outset, it would start with the existing framework of law. If that wasn't satisfactory, something else would wind up happening.
Well, thank you. And then John Chambers had a couple of comments and a question. And one of John's comments was Article 42 of the Soviet Constitution guaranteed religious rights, but you were not allowed to talk about it. But John also asked for a little clarification on the War Powers Act. He was asking, is it not really a law, but it is treated as a law, or
That's
did
exactly,
you understand that?
Yeah, it's a resolution. So it was passed by Congress, but not signed by President Nixon. But for whatever reason, it has become practice for presidents to respect the auspices of it. So they go and they report to Congress regularly. They let Congress know what's going on. And why, it's one of those situations where back during the time when the Obama administration was in charge and Democrats controlled Congress, there was an effort to get Congress to look back into actually passing the War Powers Act and getting it signed by a president. And I'll say this much. Part of the reason why that doesn't happen is because regardless of who's in power and regardless of who controls Congress, if it's the opposite party, they want to, or whatever it is, each party wants to retain that power and that flexibility should they get in control of the White House again. That's why you're not going to see it. So it suffices for the purposes that they want, but it doesn't go as far as those of us who are strict believers in the Constitution might otherwise want it to do.
Interesting, because I guess I had always heard that if the president doesn't sign a law, is that not known as a pocket veto?
Yeah. But no, that's exactly it. It's a situation, and even better, right? When Congress doesn't, when the president doesn't out and out veto it, and the anyway, it's a pocket veto, so Congress can't turn around and then override that veto.
I see. Okay.
But I guess they could, but the reality is they could try. It would raise some interesting constitutional questions. But the reality is, in the end, for whatever reason, regardless of whether or not it is an actual statute, presidents have respected the War Powers Resolution. And so what that also does is, again, it means that there are no criminal penalties if a president ignores it, which is a problem.
Yeah. Very interesting. Well, this has been a great discussion, and we are just so appreciative of you being our guest today, and just for all that you've done for Constituting America over the years. You're just such a great friend to our organization. And I'd like to just give a second for Tova and Jewel to make any parting comments that they want to make.
Yeah, thank you so much for being on. We really appreciate your time and everything.
Happy to do it.
Yeah, thank you. And to everyone watching, again, I just want to plug the book club later this week. It'll be incredible. So I hope you are able to join. And thank you all so much for being with us.
Thanks, Tova. Jewel?
Thanks for a great show. And that was pretty cool to hear from someone who had such a rich history in the topic we were talking about, too, that ended up coming around with Russia and Ukraine like that. So really appreciate it.
Glad I could.
Well, we want to invite all of our listeners back next week. We're going to be talking about treaties and the Constitution. And it's going to be a really interesting topic. We're going to talk about, what the Constitution says about treaties, but we're also going to talk a little bit about the Iran agreement that's in the news right now. And is that really a treaty? And should it be treated as a treaty rather than the way it's currently being treated? So we're looking forward to that next Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern. So thank you so much. And thank you, Andrew, for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Okay. Bye-bye.